starts the lecture by stating that the claim that science should lead to atheism is false because it relies on 4 false assumptions. And then he defines science as the process of reasoning based on systematized observation, quoting Bertrand Russell on that. And while that definition is generally sensible, okay, science is a process of reasoning about observations, not the observations themselves, that's true, it is severely lacking for the purposes of this lecture, for his lecture. It does not exclude practices of reasoning about observations that are unscientific or pseudoscientific by whatever standards you choose to demarcate science. I mean, even astrology could count as science by such a vague definition. Now, what kind of reasoning in particular is to be called science and what is not? This is what defines science in any sensible manner, right? So obviously you need to acquire a proper demarcation principle if you wish to tell apart science from naturalistic dogma, because that's exactly where the problem really lies, brother. Only those who propagate naturalistic and atheistic theories as science are those who would argue that science leads to atheism. It's the method they granted in making up those theories that leads to atheism. And it does so because it was itself founded upon the tenets of naturalism, which is the belief that only nature and natural causes exist. Okay? So no wonder that a process of reasoning about observations that presupposes such a metaphysics would lead to atheism. It is atheism at its very core. All right? He says...
Now, that's the first point. The second point I want to mention is, well, science is not the only yardstick for truth. Why? Because our observations are always going to be limited. And truth will always change from that point of view. And that's one of the beauties of science. Now, the atheist and the philosopher of science and the philosopher of biology, Professor Elliot Sober, he basically says in his essay called Empiricism that at any moment in time, scientists are limited to the observations they have at hand. Now just think of it, just use your intellect here. It's so obvious that you may have another observation that can contradict your previous conclusions based upon your previous limited observations. So therefore, truth can change in science, which is one of the beauties of science. Truth can change. What we consider to be true can change. So science is limited to what it can observe.
Now, I would be very happy to agree with you if you did not include par fiat everything that the mainstream academy would call science. The image you're painting here is that of a purely inductive science, one that relies entirely on induction and observation, where a scientist would follow the induction and the abductive reasoning built on it, wherever it takes him. One favorable example for me that I've already used in this response is CI Forensic Sciences, in the previous part. CSI Forensic Science. All forms of empirical reasoning are justifiable and indeed quite fruitful in such a discipline, in such a practice. However, not everything that the Western Academy calls science enjoys this status, obviously, or can be reduced to the simple, beautiful experimental nature that I can count tens of theories of mainstream science that are not limited to what we call, to what can be observed, okay, in principle. The theory of evolution is one striking example that I also discussed briefly in this response, one that you wouldn't mind calling beautiful too, although it is obvious that nobody has ever observed any species as it evolves from another one or from any other origin. Okay, that has never been observed. Okay, so the very concept of observation in such theories is fundamentally different from this happy, beautiful image that you're drawing here, the image of a straightforward induction. So it would be a major act of intellectual dishonesty from your part, brother, to pretend that science as such does not lead to atheism, because that's what science is like. That's only one part of what is collectively known as science in Western academia. That part you described is only one part of what is commonly known as science in Western academia. You should be well aware of that, especially since you've already declared that you've had your readings in philosophy of science, right? So when you say science is limited to what it can observe, and you mean that's what methodological naturalism implies, then you definitely don't know what you're talking about.
The third point, science is morally neutral. Or in other words, is amoral. Now, what do I mean by this? I don't mean scientists are immoral. Of course not. God forbid, right? What I'm saying here is, although scientists are human beings too, and sometimes we have a culture, we think just because he's a scientist, he's like, the religion of the white coats, right? We have that kind of assumption sometimes in popular discourse, right? Anyway, so science is morally neutral. What do I mean by this? Well, there are many things that we take to be first principles in moral theory, in meta-ethics. Meaning that there are some things that we consider to be objectively morally true. There are objective moral values in the world. There are objective moral truths. Not all of them, but I'm a true believer that we all believe in objective moral truths, regardless of what society tells us, regardless of what individual minds tell us, and regardless of what our intuitions or our psychological, our emotions tell us, right? So let me give you an example. You go home, you're tired from work or university, and you turn on the television and you see breaking news. And the headline says, man beheads 5-year-old. Now, that's morally wrong, right? Yes? Yes? No? Okay. All right, let's assume you all said no, right? An emphatic no. Of course. So we said yes, rather. What was my question? I'm going to get myself in trouble. It's morally wrong, correct? Good. Now, next question. Is it objectively morally wrong?
And that's another equivocation that shows how unqualified he is. As I elaborated in part 1, he's deeply influenced by Craig's philosophy and his famous argument about objective moral values. Now, his famous argument from objective moral values is just part of that influence on him, with just one part of it. Now, first of all, what do you mean by morally neutral? Morally neutral. What does that mean? If you mean the scientific community has no values at all to impose on all practicing scientists, this is obviously wrong, okay? And clearly that's not what he means, because he declared as much. Listening through, though, you'll find that he actually means that science has no say on which values are objectively true and which values are not. Now, this is obviously true, but the proper way to express this meaning, Brother Hamza, is not to say that science is amoral or is morally neutral. Rather, you should say empirical science has no epistemic access to moral judgment. That's the term that we use. That is, no objective moral judgment can be deduced by means of the scientific method alone on any moral question whatever. And I say alone because empirical findings can be used as one premise in a moral argument. Okay. The second premise being the moral code, which decides good from bad, of course. For example, you can use empirical science to uncover a crime and prove that someone did in fact commit the act itself, okay, providing all the evidence that implicates them. But you can't use it, you can't use science to deduce the sentence or the proper judgment for that act, for committing that act, for the crime. Why? Not because science is amoral, as ambiguous and puzzling as this really sounds, but because moral values are simply not the province of science, not the subject matter of empirical science and its methods. However, he proceeds to corrupt the concept irreparably, injecting his Craigian belief in natural selection, saying that although natural selection originated us biologically, although it created us biologically, okay, quote unquote, it did not originate our moral values, only our ability for making moral judgments. All right, he says.
So there is a problem here, because all the Darwinian mechanism can do, or to be a bit more specific, all that natural selection can do is provide us with the ability to formulate ethical rules. We agree with this.
Oh, no, we don't. This is false on more than one count. First, the Darwinian belief that natural selection is what brought us about implies that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates new species by try and error, or by hit and miss, okay? Nature selects only those of his creatures that fit. So no Muslim should believe in this concept at all, under any claim of divine agency whatsoever. Second, the claim that natural selection brought about our ability to make moral judgments implies that that property itself in man is nothing more than a physical and chemical operation that was selected by nature, and that's a materialistic, naturalistic position that has no place in a Muslim's beliefs. All right. Third, this claim implies the unreliability of that biological tool of moral judgment itself. Okay, if it is biological, then how can it be reliable? If evolution were true, then morality would be nothing but the accidental, biological, I mean evolutionary. Okay, of course, because that's what biological means in mainstream science now. If evolution were true, then morality would be nothing but the accidental product of mutation that happened to be selected, with moral judgment only pointing creatures towards what favors survival and reproduction, essentially. That's what natural selection would select, right? And if naturalism were true, then morality is nothing but the intersubjective agreement between sentient beings on what best serves their collective welfare. Okay, there should be nothing more to it. There would be no grounds to suppose any higher values that separate humans from apes, or apes from houseflies, or any other species for that matter. They all seek to reproduce and to survive. Okay, that would be all that defines morality in a naturalistic worldview. If, however, objective moral values do exist, and obviously they do, one way or another, then this should contradict both naturalism and Darwinism, since the latter was founded upon the first, of course, and would not just defeat naturalism alone, as Alvin Plantinga would have you believe. He argued in the early 90s on similar grounds that you can either embrace one or the other, but not both, because unfortunately he couldn't dare dismiss the entirety of the theory of evolution along with naturalism as he should. However, Hamza proceeds to contradict himself as he seems to be trying to elaborate the third point I just articulated. He says,
it gives you the ability to formulate ethical rules, but it doesn't give you a foundation to justify or take into account objective moral truths. Why? Because these morals are subject, not objective anymore. They're subject to inevitable biological changes. Not only that, morals lose any meaning under biology. They lose meaning because it's just almost arbitrary. It's like a result of a accidental rearing of certain biological conditions. That's why science is amoral from this perspective, or morally neutral from this perspective.
Well, then what business do you have agreeing with natural selection and Darwinism as a whole, being the mechanism that gave us the ability to make moral judgments? You admit that this defeats the objectivity of those judgments. And yet you choose to agree with the doctrine of evolution through natural selection and that we could embrace it practically? How can that work for you?
Science can't deal with the hard problem of consciousness. Yes, it does great work concerning how we think, cognition, the fact that we are able to think, and it can deal with all of these things.
You contradict yourself with this statement, Brother Hamza. Wasn't it you who just defined science less than 10 minutes ago as the process of reasoning about observations? Well, what observations have we ever had of thoughts or cognitions? None, obviously. What we observe on brain scanners are really brain activities that may or may not correlate with some thoughts, feelings, or memories. Empirical science can indeed examine the impact that certain changes in brain chemistry or brain electricity could have on mental processes in the human being, but that's not the mental processes themselves. Okay? That's not the mind. That's not the workings of the mind. Thoughts and feelings are not electrochemical processes in the brain or in the nervous system. Muslims should know better than this ignorant reductionist view, that monist view that materialists hold of the mind, what it is and how it works. We know from the Quran that the family of processes that we call the mind do not even take place in the brain to begin with. The mind in Islam, al-aql, is not an ontological entity at all. Okay, it's a process that takes place by the self and nafs, essentially in the heart. Allah says in no uncertain terms in the Quran, أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا أَوْ آذَانٌ يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارُ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. And I translate, have they not walked the earth with hearts to reason with and ears to hear with? Indeed, it is not the eyes that go blind, it's the hearts that are within the chests. Okay, it's the hearts in the chests that reason. Okay, and it is the hearts in the chest that fail to see the truth. No way around that. How exactly does the unobservable process that's taking place in the heart affect the brain and get affected by it? That's an iceberg that we can barely see the tip of. So by your definition, there can be no empirical science of thoughts and cognition. Okay, only theoretical, as in psychology with its different subfields. Okay, theoretical psychology, that is, because now today we have philosophical psychology, theoretical psychology, and empirical psychology, a distinction that has come to be around for quite a while now. Besides, who said that the fact that makes us human is that we have internal subjective conscious or subconscious states? Who said that? How do you know that other species don't have that as well? Okay, have you ever observed a subconscious state in humans and decided that since you can't find one in other species, then this must be what makes us human? Pay attention to every word you use, Brother Hamza, or you will almost definitely do more damage than good. And again, he goes on to counter himself. Has he not just stated that science is able to study how we think, or the cognition, or the process of thinking? Listen to this.
There is an internal experience that you're having. There's an internal subjective conscious experience that you're having. You could ask the question, what is it like for Abdul or Susan or John or Fatima to have a strawberry on a Sunday morning dipped in double cream? What is it like? And that answer cannot be found using science, because we're dealing with someone's inner subjective conscious state. And if I were to know everything about the human mind and map out all the neurochemical, electrochemical happenings and firings, right, and correlate them with someone's experience, I will still not know what it's like for that person to have that experience, because it's just neuroscience is a study of correlations. It's just a study of correlations. So I would not know what it's like for that person to have that inner subjective conscious experience. All I have are utterances, linguistic utterances of the description of the inner subjective conscious state.
But brother, everything you just said is true of every mental and emotional experience that humans have, including thought and cognition. So which way is it? Are mental processes only accessible to science in terms of the visible correlations between mental states on one hand and neurological and brain activity on the other? Oh, okay. It's not the thoughts or the cognition themselves that science can study. Then is it, brother? Okay. Is it that, or is it the fact that the thoughts and the cognitions themselves can be subject matter for science? Which way should we go? The problem then is not just with consciousness, whatever that means. It's with the philosophy. It's with the philosophy of cognitive and neurosciences in general. It's with those philosophies. It was the materialist approach to those fields.
Generally speaking, when I give these lectures, is to plant seeds in your heart and mind so you continue your own intellectual and spiritual journey. I'm not here to teach you anything. Rather, I consider these lectures therapy for myself, right?
That's not funny, brother. If anything, this shows that you have a serious problem with intent, with niyyah. Okay? You're not doing this to be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're doing it to satisfy yourself, I'm afraid. May Allah fix your troubled heart and soul and bless you with ikhlas.
The next issue is that science is not the only yardstick for truth, because there are other sources of knowledge. And for me, this is the most frustrating. It's like people are not even bothered to read a basic philosophy book. Philosophy 101. If you're 16 years old and buy an A-level standard book on epistemology, the study of knowledge, and you would see that there are other sources of knowledge other than just touching and feeling things.
Are you serious? Are you actually claiming that the proper way for people to admit that there are other sources of knowledge than natural science is to study some beginner textbooks on epistemology? Did you do that when you chose to become a Muslim? To convince yourself that though you cannot touch or feel your Creator or observe Him in any way, you have to admit that He's there with no science involved? I really hope, for your sake, that that's not how you became a Muslim, Brother Hamza, because there's no telling what could become of you tomorrow, okay? Following up on those readings, those types of readings. Like it or not, you're not safe from heresy, zandaqa, if you start the way you're advising people to start here. It seems to me that that's precisely why you lost your own path to the true creed of Islam. Oh yeah, you're not on the right way in your religion, brother, by the way. And it's about time somebody showed you that this is the case. This is what happens to those who claim what you so ambiguously called a spiritual path in books of philosophy. So brothers and sisters, be warned, okay? Do not do that. What really surprises me and tells me that this man has unfortunately studied Islam from at least two fundamentally incompatible traditions at the same time is that after all this chatter about how it's important to start your readings with books on epistemology to even know that there are different sources of knowledge besides natural science, he comes at the very end of the lecture to establish a Salafi understanding of fitrah as an actual innate knowledge that Islam draws upon in people, that Islam awakens in them in different ways. That's absolutely true, of course. However, it's gravely incompatible with the idea of taking philosophy as a starting point for anything at all, spiritual or otherwise. There's a reason why Salaf condemned philosophy, Brother Hamza, and by philosophy, they generally meant the practice of questioning everything and subjecting all claims to the principle of theoretical skepticism and theoretical argumentation. As a Muslim, you have to draw the line somewhere, and philosophy forbids that. Philosophy has no lines at all, no boundaries whatever. A Muslim cannot embrace fitra while submitting to that epistemic principle, to the epistemic conditions and principles of doing philosophy or kalam. I hope that one day you will understand this and sort out that tangle of beliefs and creeds you've mixed up as you progress with your personal studies of Islam.
The second false assumption is science works, therefore its conclusions are true. Science works, guys, therefore its conclusions are true. Well, that's not true. Let me explain. If we study the history of science, you will see that there were theories that were working, that provided things that we now call truths, but we eventually found out that those theories are false.
False is an epistemic judgment that can only be established in empirical sciences by means of direct observation of the exact opposite of what the old theory proposed. And this, my brother, almost never happened in the history of science. If the claim is inductive, which by the way is the most solid and reliable form of science, the one that gives you laws and law-like claims, okay, despite what Popper used to think about induction, then an observation of the opposite of what you've induced thus far does not falsify your induction itself. In fact, a multitude of such counter-observations does not do that either. The worst they can do is disconfirm the induction probabilistically, make you start to think that, oh, perhaps I have generalized it a bit too far. In most cases, however, they suggest other regularities or additional conditionals for the old regularity to hold true. They don't falsify it, okay? They don't prove it false. You don't drop the belief that swans are white the moment you observe a black swan, like Popper so naively suggests in his famous example. You start to investigate why it is the case that this particular swan is black, unlike the norm that you've induced so far. Okay, that's the question that you start following up on. So this actually opens up additional knowledge, not compels you to let go of previous knowledge. So if the falsifiability criterion doesn't actually work with induction, what do you expect it would do with other types of reasoning in science that rely entirely on analogy and metaphor? Not to mention theories that venture into the metaphysical, the purely metaphysical, that cannot even be observed at all. Okay, what do you expect falsifiability would do to those? The point is the term false is only achievable in empirical sciences is only achievable with certainty, with what you would call deductive certainty or philosophical certainty. Okay, if the counter observation is a completely theory-free observation, completely theory-free. Okay, that once you see it, it tells you immediately the exact contrary to what a previous theory proposed, without a single level of interpretation or theorization involved in the documentation of that observation whatsoever. None. In other words, without what Pierre Duhem would call a theory-laden observation. All right, it has to be anything but that. And again, this almost never happens in natural science. This is why, when post-positivist philosophers wish to convey the meaning that a certain theory is no longer found plausible, they would say it's been superseded, not falsified or defeated or proven false or anything like that. And by that they meant that we used to have some analogy or metaphor in the past to model, describe, and explain a certain set of phenomena, and now we're using another analogy or metaphor that seems to be more helpful than the one we had before. It seems to make more sense and to give us more knowledge of the phenomenon in question. The phenomena in question. The basic definitions, thus, would differ from one theory to another, and while both could be used to explain and possibly describe and predict certain phenomena, neither of them should claim to have provided us with the actual ontology of what's going on metaphysically, the actual ontology of the phenomena in question. Okay, the حقيقة هذه الظواهر. If it looks like a snake and it behaves like a snake, then a blind man holding an elephant's tail would be more than welcome to treat it as such, as though it actually were a snake. As though it actually were. Okay? I repeat, as though it actually were. The theory would work for him, despite the fact that the actual ontology of the subject matter of the question in hand is fundamentally different. And there would be no means to tell if indeed it is a snake, or just a rope that's being wriggled by someone standing above, or anything else that feels, smells, and moves the way that this thing does. Okay? So you see that there can be no arguing that either one of these metaphors is false. Okay, there can be no, there cannot be any knowing actually in any definite manner. They're both true in some sense and both false in another. This is why theory might still work despite the fact that the scientific community no longer embraces it. Newton's equations of gravitation, for example, rely on an entirely different concept of time, motion, space, and gravity from the ones that Einstein wrote about. And yet physicists are still using those equations to this day and only save Einstein's field equations for exotic cosmological propositions, okay, that supposedly cannot be handled by the equations of Newton. What matters to a theorist is the scope of its ontological validity. Okay, even the phlogiston theory that you bring up, brother, cannot be called false in the sense that your characterization would have people believe. A stubborn theorist could still attempt to somehow bring both theories, the phlogiston theory and the theory of combustion, under some common analogy, under one analogy. Okay, as daunting and uncalled for such an exercise would be. Okay, perhaps there is some unobservable material that emanates from the subject of combustion as it burns and causes oxygen to oxidize the burning subject the way that it does. Perhaps the other way is the case, okay, in causation, that is. Perhaps they both happen because of something else metaphysically hidden from us entirely. The only reason that the scientific community would find such an assumption absurd, okay, of a theory that actually combines both these theories, is because I said unobservable. Okay, despite the fact that a great many theories do in fact include in their ontologies something that is unobservable. Nobody aspires to ever observe space-time, for example, okay, whatever that thing is. Just like nobody ever thought they could one day observe the luminiferous ether of the 19th century. Some physicists did not shy away from asserting that space-time, as metaphysically absurd an entity as it actually is only another ether after all, okay? And only another invisible ether, after all, that fills all of space. I could even quote Einstein himself from some of his writings in the 20s saying something to that effect, okay, about the space-time actually being just another ether. My point is, nothing in the actual practice of the scientific method could warrant falsification in such a strong sense as you seem to believe, or even a weak sense. It's not that they prove to be false. And that's generally okay, instrumentally speaking. It's only because it only becomes a problem when a scientist loses sight of the limits of this method, of what subject matters should not even be addressed by it in the first place, and of the fact that all he actually has, at the end of the day, apart from overwhelmingly established inductions, is a working analogy. Okay? Not a perfectly matching description of the world, just an analogy. Okay? Methodological naturalism, however, by its very nature, defeats this understanding, leading to all kinds of absurd ontologies and unwarranted metaphysical beliefs. How can you even begin to falsify, verify, justify, confirm, disconfirm, prove or disprove, or whatever, a theory that takes the entire universe for its subject matter? How? You will have nothing in the way of observation more than a multitude of self-confirming interpretations of numerous observations about the universe as it is, as you observe it. Ones that could easily be replaced entirely by interpretations that match a rival theory, another theory altogether, with absolutely nothing to determine which one of the two is more plausible. Methodological naturalism would invite you to attempt a metaphor or analogy that encompasses the entire universe, despite the fact that we obviously have no epistemic access to such a subject matter, because it presupposes that everything that exists is, in principle, analogous to what we observe. Everything that exists is natural. Everything is natural, okay? Anyway, so why not? Okay, if everything is natural, then why not come up with any such with such analogies and metaphors as we please? What could hold them back from assuming any kind of absurdity in describing what they so vaguely call the universe, whichever way they like? Or what could stop them from making it a multiverse, for that matter? Nothing. Methodologically speaking, nothing could stop them. And let the mathematical formulations of such analogies drive them whichever way they would. What could stop that? Okay? What's to stop them from turning mathematical possibility to ontological reality, like Hawking, for example, did in pretty much everything he theorized? It's only due to methodological naturalism that theories are now compared to each other on nothing more than mathematical elegance, internal consistency, and other superficial criteria that serve no purpose other than make a theory look as scientifically agreeable as possible. That's all. No epistemic warrant really for anything. Methodological naturalism is the reason for the deep philosophical pit that modern science has drowned into, the deep metaphysical nonsense that scientists are now spewing around. But nobody is willing to admit that. To a devout naturalist, the very idea of a crisis is little more than a tempting opportunity for a new Einstein to come along one day and repeat the entire story of the 20th century all over again. Why not? Okay, that's a good opportunity to become a star, and who wouldn't want to go down in history as the next Albert Einstein after all? Okay, it really doesn't matter what particular beliefs this or that theory would imply, just as long as we all stick to the general tenets of naturalism. Okay, dream up whatever universe you wish our world to look like, and whatever story you like to tell as its history and its evolution. And you're more than welcome as long as you play with the rules, okay? This is why it ought to be clarified here that you don't need to ascribe to a particular mythology about the universe in order to qualify as a naturalist. You don't have to believe, for example, in a universe that has always been like we observe it today and always will be, as philosophers used to believe before the emergence of relativistic cosmology. You only have to embrace the metaphysical tenets upon which such mythology is produced. Such mythology and other mythologies is produced, okay? Which can be summed up in a nutshell in the phrase, nature is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Such tenets that take methodological naturalism for its epistemology. That's what you have to believe, okay? What you make of those then, what theories you come up with and publish in any scientific circles that of relevance to it, that's okay. It doesn't matter. It doesn't put you out of science as they define it. And because of methodological naturalism, that's how they have come to define it.
So the second assumption that science works, therefore it's true, is a false assumption. Let's go to the third false assumption. The third false assumption is science leads to certainty. I mean, who says this? You know when people throw out there, right, in the popular sphere, I had this morning on my Facebook, I think. Someone said, scientific fact. Like this, like Moses tablets coming from God himself. And there's a Moses tablet called Scientific Fact number 345. Yeah? And it gives you the fact. And that Moses tablet cannot change. It's engraven in stone. Scientific facts are not like that. They're not like that. For example, many people believe the Darwinian mechanism to be a scientific fact, which basically means in scientific language, a well-confirmed theory that can change. That's what it means. That's what it means, people. Even the evangelical Richard Dawkins, who's like in love with the Darwinian mechanism, he writes about it and he's a popularizer and he's an academic. He even said, I think it's in his book, The Devil's Chaplain, he said, well, in 10 years or in the future, we could have future observations that can really contradict or change the way we see the Darwinian mechanism. It could look completely different.
Absolutely. But are they willing to let go of the very concept of evolution itself, okay, through one natural mechanism or another? The very concept of evolution by a natural mechanism? Absolutely not. Why? Because it's the only game in town, like Dawkins himself would say on different occasions. There has to be some naturalistic mechanism to explain how all those species came to be, historically, without inviting any form of supernatural agency or teleology whatsoever. And that's why Darwin formulated the theory to begin with. It must continue to be so because of methodological naturalism. Because of methodological naturalism. A naturalist needs to hold on to some naturalistic theory that would continue to take the social stature of knowledge in addressing such a foundational question of religion. Who are we and where did we come from? And since Darwin's idea of conjuring up naturalistic mechanisms whereby all species would be claimed to have evolved from some simple ancestral life forms throughout the history of the world fits the bill perfectly like no other theory could possibly do, it will never be replaced. And that's why every naturalist, every biologist who ascribes to naturalistic methodological naturalism would so proudly declare that evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact. That's what they believe, and that's what they would insist on, and they would resort to what they call microevolution deceptively to try to convince you that this is the case. But this, however, is not true. Evolution is a theory, and it's not even science. It's a philosophy. It's a naturalistic philosophy. It's a naturalistic mythology. Okay? Why do they insist on making it a fact? Whatever mechanisms, neo-Darwinism, or whatever you wish to come up with in explaining how it actually happened, you have to believe that it is what happened, because that's the only way they can put the idea of the emergence of that multitude of living species on the earth naturally, the emergence through natural causes. That's the only way they can think of it. You will immediately find yourself excommunicated from the Church of Naturalism for the rest of your life if you challenge evolution itself. Okay, if you challenge the idea of evolution itself. The point is, Brother Hamza, our problem with evolutionism is not with the claim that natural selection, for example, is a final fact that can never be challenged. It's a final fact. Okay, an established fact that can never be challenged. It's with the very principle of proposing some natural mechanism at all by which all species were presumably created. And what is that again? That's right, methodological naturalism. That's what it is. And that is, by the way, the same reason why we should reject ID theories, okay, or intelligent design theories. Because Densky, Behe, and co. had to embrace methodological naturalism and all the mechanisms of evolution that are currently accepted in the scientific community and propose some additional mechanism, some intelligent designer as yet another mechanism that should explain what the other mainstream mechanisms allegedly could not. What the other mechanisms allegedly could not explain. So it's not the creator we believe in that they proposed there. It's the naturalistic mechanism that, according to Behe himself, could well be some alien intelligence that intervened in the story of evolution on Earth by creating things that cannot be created by random mutation and natural selection. All right, you're free to believe that it was in fact that. Behe and other proponents of that theory are adamant and they always insist in every occasion that they do not wish it to be a theological theory or a theory that proves the existence of the creator of Christianity or Islam or any other revealed religion. Okay, it can be, and as a matter of fact, if you look at the way that the theory itself was founded and the presumptions that the theory embraces, you cannot end up believing in any of these accounts of creation. You cannot end up believing in the creator of Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Okay, you have to believe in some a natural creator, naturalistic creator. The detailed applications of the theory are not within the scope of this response, however, so perhaps I would discuss it in detail in a special lecture in the future, inshallah ta'ala.
Now, before I move on to the final false assumption, I want to talk about just a quick note on falsification. Now, Karl Popper, he understood the problem of induction. His science, you can't prove scientific theories to be true in a philosophical sense. You can't prove scientific theories to be true in an absolute philosophical sense. You could just show that they were confirmed, but they may not be true from that point of view, from a philosophical point of view. And he felt that was a problem, and he agreed you can't solve the problem of induction. So what did he invent, if you like? He basically brought into existence this idea of falsification. He said scientific theories can't be proven to be true in an absolute way, but they can be proven to be false. The knowledge that you can have is knowledge of what theories are false. That's the knowledge that a scientist should be looking for. And he called this falsification. Now, what is falsification in a nutshell? It is the following. If a theory claims that something would be observed under certain circumstances and it is not observed, then the theory is proved false.
Oh, that's not how Popper understood the so-called problem of induction, Brother Hamza. No. He believed, just like Hume did, that induction does not lead to knowledge. He embraced the alleged problem for the very same reason that Hume himself invented it, and that is naturalism. Because Hume was a naturalist, devout naturalist, and a self-proclaimed atheist, his metaphysics did not include any providence or teleology ordained upon, or wisdom ordained upon the events of the world from beyond it. And without the innate knowledge of the Creator, His providence and His lordship, His sovereignty over the world, you would have no reason at all to expect the world to follow any form of order or regularity whatever in the way that events unfold in it. There would be nothing to guarantee that the sun would rise tomorrow just like it did today and has been doing ever since the first human walked this earth. Okay, if there's no giver of order, then what grounds would there be, would one have to assume it? And thereby expect the next observed case to follow this or that pattern that we have induced, or this or that regularity. There would be no concept of regularity at all. we would have none. Okay, no justification whatsoever. This means that the problem of induction is actually a defeater for the very enterprise of science itself. What business do we have studying what we call the laws of nature if we don't even believe in the very principle of order and regularity itself? Regularity. So because Popper was also a naturalist, instead of blowing it out of the water, he embraced the proclaimed problem and attempted to do away with induction in science altogether. Okay? This is why he came up with his falsification principle. A theory is true not as long as further induction would confirm it, but only as long as no falsifying observation has come along yet. And that's really not here or there, because, as I explained earlier, no such observation would ever come about, even with the simplest and most straightforward inductions or induced regularities that we know. If one day, instead of dropping to the ground, I found an apple that levitates in the sky falling from a tree, this would by no means falsify the principle of free fall under gravity in my knowledge. It wouldn't do away with gravity, no matter how many times I happen upon such odd cases. It would only invite an additional hypothesis for some additional regularity, that's all. I can only presume that this is what you mean by changing the assumptions of the theory in your lecture. However, this would not render you a soft-Popperian as you claim. Okay? It should suffice to put you fairly and squarely out of the Popperian doctrine altogether, out of Popperianism altogether. Okay? It is only because induction works and because we believe events of the world to be inducible in principle that we can do this with our theories when a counter observation comes along to what we have previously induced, and that's fundamentally counter-Popperian because it involves induction which Karl Popper didn't even believe in. Okay?
The next part of this assumption is methodological naturalism. Now, this is not a problem for theists, especially the Islamic tradition. Now, what's methodological naturalism? It's basically the assertion that for any scientific conclusion or theory to be scientific, it cannot refer to the divine power or creativity. That's all it's saying. It doesn't say God doesn't exist. It just says, for your science to be science, for your conclusion to be scientific, for your theory to be scientific, just don't refer to God's power or divine wisdom or creativity.
This is what I referred to earlier as the naive, dumbed-down definition of methodological naturalism. Okay, that is the one that is only popularized for lay people to think that there is no particular epistemology that presupposes naturalism and has in fact been plaguing the scientific community since its inception in antiquity, to the extent that entire disciplines of science were founded upon it and thereby should not even be called science at all. Naturalistic mythology would be a more fitting name. Okay. Nobody is willing to take such a devastating stance with regards to the very foundations of the Western Academy because nobody is willing to pay the social and intellectual price that it entails. It's just as simple as that. So instead of exposing the actual extent of the problem here, if they are aware of it at all, many religious apologists would do pretty much what Hamza is doing here, reducing the issue to a set of false assumptions that are only added to scientific theories, okay, after their inception, after the fact, in what he so ambiguously calls philosophical naturalism. Some, however, would go a couple of steps further in service of certain propositions they have chosen to embrace with respect to particular theories, as in the case of Alvin Plantinga, for example. Plantinga chose to openly criticize methodological naturalism in his research and in his publications, admitting that it cannot be separated from the naturalistic doctrine that it emerged from. However, he only did that because he sought to defend ID theory, and he surmised that it's only because the theory presupposed a supernatural designer, it had to be rejected on the grounds that such a hypothesis is not scientific by definition. Since he so reductively defined naturalism itself as the belief that no such being as God or anything like God existed, he consequently reduced methodological naturalism to the imposed methodological restraints against proposing God or anything like God as an explanatory factor in any theory. However, as I explained earlier, metaphysical naturalism, or the doctrine of naturalism, is not to be defined as such. It's the belief that only the natural exists, or has ever existed, only the natural. And so, the proper definition of methodological naturalism that follows from that would be that only naturalistic theories or hypotheses could be accepted as knowledge of what exists. If it exists in reality, if it's out there or has ever happened in the past, then it can only be natural. in principle. And if it is indeed natural, then it can only be discovered or learnt about by means of the scientific method. That's it. That's the story. Okay? If it exists or it ever happened at all, then science should be the only way to know that. The only way to have epistemic access to it. That's what methodological naturalism really means, actually means. Okay, that's what it boils down to. So to claim that it only says that for a theory to be scientific, it cannot resort to divine creativity as an explanation is just like saying it is not fruitful for the purposes of natural science to just say that things are the way they are because God made them so, which is epistemically speaking only true under one condition, that by natural science we only mean the work we do to uncover immediate observable natural causes that could help us control a given phenomenon for our benefit. This, however, is not the full scope of science as practiced by Western Academy as we elaborated earlier. Natural science is to be defined under naturalism as the study of everything that really exists or has ever really existed. Okay? Why? Because if nature is all there is, then it follows logically that that would be the subject matter that the actual scope of natural and the actual scope of natural science, the subject matter of science. Okay, the subject matter of science would be everything that exists or has ever existed. And this, Brother Hamza, is what we mean by methodological naturalism. Some would provide an even more useless articulation of methodological naturalism, reducing it into the phrase, the supernatural does not fall within the scope of natural science. That's it. Okay, that's what they would claim methodological naturalism to mean, which is obviously nothing more than a silly tautology, really. Of course, the study of the supernatural does not fall within the scope of natural science. What does that give us? What does that teach us? Nothing. Methodological naturalism, however, is the doctrine that holds that the supernatural does not exist at all. So nothing that exists in reality is to be excluded from the scope and the realm of natural science and the scientific method. In other words, scientific theories should encompass all of reality. This is why they wouldn't accept any proposition of divine action as an explanation for anything. Not because science has no business investigating the supernatural. Okay? I hope you can see the fundamental distinction here, because it really makes a huge difference in how we Muslims should decide what to call science and what not to call science. We have methodological naturalism, which stems from metaphysical naturalism, and both would constitute philosophical naturalism or the quasi-religious doctrine of naturalism as a whole. It's not that we have methodological naturalism as opposed to philosophical naturalism like Brother Hamza maintains here. Okay? The method that follows logically from the metaphysical tenets of naturalism are every bit as philosophical as the rest of the doctrine. There is no scientific naturalism. Okay? All naturalism is philosophical by definition, both the metaphysical belief and the epistemology that draws upon it. If you believe that nature is all there is, then it follows logically that your epistemology would be one where no knowledge about reality, about what really exists, should come from any other source but natural science. You wouldn't be justified in claiming any other source for it. That's the epistemology that would determine the way you apply the scientific method, and that's what we call methodological naturalism. Period. If on the other hand you believe, like we Muslims should, that there is a vast realm of existence that is beyond nature itself, both in time and in place, and that in that realm is the creator of everything that exists, then you shouldn't accept such an epistemology, obviously. You should instead draw a clear, unambiguous distinction between the part of reality, both in place and in time, that is to be called natural, and thereby could reasonably and justifiably be investigated via the scientific method, and that part which is not to be called natural, and thereby should not be approached by that method in any way. If you believe in such a methodological restriction upon the ontological subject or scope of natural science, which you obviously should, then you should reject methodological naturalism by definition.
Now, this is not a problem for the Muslim, because the Muslim believes that the whole universe is made up of physical causes.
No, we Muslims do not believe that the whole universe is made up of physical causes. Absolutely not. Causes, or asbab, are of course everywhere in the heavens and the earth. We do not deny that. We have no problem with that. But physical causes, that's not true or acceptable, brother. You are presupposing that all causes everywhere in the world should be physical, as in following natural laws or the laws of physics as we know them. But how did you get to that conclusion? How did you get to know that, Brother Hamza? How do you know that? Well, you don't. You didn't get to know it. You have no grounds for it. That's what methodological naturalism has led you to believe, and you don't even know it. Without methodological naturalism, you would have no grounds to make such an assumption whatsoever. Instead, you would insist, as I just explained, on restricting the natural and the physical, by definition, to the realm of our immediate experience as humans. Okay? Because after all, that's what our actual inductions, those inductions that gave us what we so loosely call the laws of nature, have really covered thus far. Okay, that's the farthest reach of our observation and experience. Okay, it should not surpass that. It should not go beyond that. We are not justified in stretching the laws of nature as we know them from our limited experience in the world to cover the entirety of the universe, all the heavens and all the earths. We don't have that epistemic right. Only methodological naturalism gives you that right, provides such justification, and that's false. That's naturalistic. That stems from and presupposes philosophical naturalism, as you would call it. Because it's the epistemology of those who believe on sheer faith that there is no causes but the natural causes, and no existence beyond that which is natural. Have you ever asked yourself, Brother Hamza, why it is the case that although our sensorial experience is only limited to that very small part of the world that we actually live in, philosophers have only ever proposed theories about the entire world so easily and so happily and so confidently, ever since antiquity, ever since the time of pre-Socratic philosophy? Have you ever stopped to wonder why this has always been the case since the birth of the Western Academy in ancient Greece? Why have they been doing theories in such a manner? And more importantly, have you ever wondered why you've never considered this question before, and why you take it for granted that this is how science should be done? Okay, every theory should be proposed to cover the entire world unless restricted by the implications of another theory. Why is this the way that natural philosophy has always been done? And why are you here to tell us that we should be doing it this way? You do believe in angels and in jinn, I hope. So do you believe those to be running on physical causes, Brother Hamza? Do you believe miracles to have taken place under physical causes too? All of them? Are you asking us to believe that they all submitted to the laws of physics? Think about it, and hopefully you will be able to come up with the answer and the proper position that you should take as a Muslim towards this arrogant approach to human knowledge and to the limitation of human experience. All in all, I hope it's been made sufficiently clear here that the man has not studied this issue as carefully as he should. He then proceeds to commit an outrage in the question of how to reconcile between religious knowledge and scientific theory in case of ontological contradiction. He so happily declares, embrace them both.
See, from my point of view, you could do both. Let me tell you what I mean by both. I'll be very careful here. You can, as a scientist, accept the fact, given what we discussed about the philosophy of science, doesn't lead to absolute certainty, can change, can have future observations that contradict previous conclusions. You can accept as a limited human endeavor that produces limited conclusions that are not absolutely true. And you can accept it practically as a scientist, that based on our human limited knowledge, that this is what we've concluded, but it's not true that I have to enter it into my creed or my philosophical worldview, but it's true from the point of view that it's just practical. But I can still accept the Quran because it comes from a source that is true absolutely. And therefore you could never say science now contradicts revelation, especially from a Muslim point of view, because you've just committed an epistemic disqualification. One's human limited knowledge, one's divine knowledge. It's as simple as that. And you can't even compare the both, because one is, for example, one understands the picture, the other just observes the pixel. It's not a problem. You could respect both, and you could adopt both, one practically and understand it's limited and it's as a human endeavor and we're just doing it practically, and you keep with the divine revelation because you know it's from the divine. Now,
what on earth are you even talking about? Either you believe that the world did have a beginning in the past, a beginning into the past, a beginning point in the past, or you don't. Okay? You cannot in any sensible manner carry two contradictory beliefs about something that is purely and entirely unobservable and take excuse in the claim that the so-called scientific account is only human. It's incomplete, and you're only accepting it insofar as it is practically helpful to do so. Instrumentalism only makes sense when you accept the instrumental component of a theory, while at the same time you're free to either accept or reject the ontology upon which it is founded. This is something that scientists themselves do all the time. They would resort to the mathematics of an old theory because they view those mathematical formulations to be easier approximations to the truth than those of the theory that superseded that theory, okay, while not necessarily accepting the ontology of the old theory. This is so because, as we elaborated earlier, all theories that involve mathematical models construct their models on of the reality in question based on a particular analogy or metaphor, one way or another. So while you may fundamentally disagree with the ontology that the metaphor implies, or that the metaphor itself was built upon, and the metaphysical definitions that the theorist adopted in its favor, that still should not keep you from benefiting practically and instrumentally from the area of the mathematical model itself that agrees with observation. I have written and published fundamental criticisms of both theories of relativity, the special and the general, and argued extensively that Muslims should not by any means accept the ontologies that either of these theories were founded on. In special relativity, you cannot accept Einstein's dismissal of the very concept of absolute simultaneity for the plethora of irrationalities that this brings about, including devastating entailments for the attributes of the Lord, as I elaborated in many other occasions. The same is true, but to a lesser extent, of the dismissal of absolute rest, the concept of absolute rest. I argued that you cannot accept the ontology of Minkowski spacetime and the way it presents time and space as a single entity that exists outside of our minds and that is constantly impacted by the motion of moving bodies in a way that always works to keep the speed of light nominally constant. The ontological entailments of the concept of time dilation and length contraction as described in special relativity and modeled in Minkowski spacetime are fundamentally contradictory in the sense that they would allow for an observer from one imaginary reference frame that is chosen arbitrarily to see an ontologically different reality from the one that another observer from another arbitrary reference frame would observe. Okay, which has been expressed in a number of famous paradoxes that physicists who have been indoctrinated into the theory would insist are not contradictory at all, just paradoxes as they would call them. The ontology of what Einstein calls a coordinate frame of reference is fundamentally different from what used to be called an inertial frame, in that the latter is an actual physical phenomenon that is governed by the principle of relativity and the physics of inertial motion, while the former is purely a mental construct. Okay. And yet Einstein treats them both as one and the same in the way that he would apply the Lorentzian transformation from one frame to another. All of these major philosophical problems I argued against in the metaphysics and the ontology of special relativity do not and should not discourage me from continuing to make instrumental use of the gamma factor and the Lorentzian equations in every practical application that involves them, like in GPS calculations, for example, because the metaphor, as fundamentally irrational and fundamentally objectionable as it is, does offer equations that work for all intents and purposes. The same is true of the silly idea of the physical substantivalist spacetime that affects and is affected by the masses of bodies that move through it in general relativity. The entailment of this concept and the metaphysical notion of space and time that it embraces are also damaging to our beliefs in the attributes of Allah, in that they imply that He Himself should exist outside of both space and time, and thus nothing He does should be described in terms of time, and by no means should anyone describe Him as existing above the world, as is literally mentioned in the Quran. Why? Because the concept of above and below are special meanings that only belong to things that float inside of the so-called space-time. Craig embraces that entailment in his theory of a God that was timeless before the Big Bang and only entered into time with the bang. Okay. Of course, he had another belief that also led him to that conclusion. That is his belief in the impossibility of actual infinites, which is held dearly by Brother Hamza here, unfortunately. Time must have had a beginning in the past, so it would be meaningless to describe God as having done this or that before the Big Bang, since the very meaning of the word before would have a beginning with the event itself. This is, of course, false and leads to the very destruction of the word event and the very meaning of happening or becoming, as I cannot endeavor to explain in detail in the limited space of this response. I can also point out here, by the way, that Einstein himself embraced the entailments of both his relativity theories, ontologically and metaphysically. Einstein was a philosopher of science, by the way. He was someone who really understood what he was talking about, and he understood the entailments and the consequences of his theories, and he embraced them to the fullest. Okay, that's why he embraced Spinoza's creator, or Spinoza's concept of a creator. Okay, that deistic, pantheistic entity that is actually nothing more than the laws of nature themselves. All right, Einstein understood that if he believed and if he embraced the ontology of both of his theories seriously, and he did take them seriously, then he can only believe in this concept of a God. All right, if he was ever to declare anything that what would be called God at all. All right. The point I'm trying to make here is that despite the extremely false and unacceptable ontologies that both relativity theories are founded on, we have no problem making instrumental use of the metaphysics in cases where it makes sense and brings actual benefit to do so. I hold this to be an acceptable instrumentalist position, considering the practical value in some of the theory's equations. Okay? However, the same cannot be said of the example that Hamza is making here. If I happen upon a case where some theory about the origin of the universe tells me something that contradicts the Quran, I will not accept it instrumentally or any otherwise. It will be rejected categorically, starting from the very method that was used to propose it in the first place. Whatever the mathematics that it involves, I will have no use for that, no practical use, since it would only be describing a purely mythological account of the history of the universe. So I will not be justified in resorting to any form of instrumentalism in such a case. The entire discipline of cosmology is of no practical use whatsoever, as someone like Lawrence Krauss was happy to admit on more than one occasion, by the way. Considering its subject matter, whatever theory naturalists would come up with in that field, in that subject matter, it is not a practically tolerable, pixelated understanding of the world, as you would call it, and thereby would be justified in only embracing it instrumentally. It's a fundamentally and methodological false and unacceptable use of the scientific method in its very principle. Mathematics should not be used to formulate such models in the first place, and we should take a very strong stance in this respect. So to claim that a Muslim would be justified in believing that the world did begin to exist because he finds this in the Quran, while simultaneously accepting a proclaimed scientific claim that it never had a beginning in the past for the sake of practical worth, like the example he makes, would be like claiming that it's okay to believe that the Creator exists and he does not exist simultaneously for some practical benefits that come from one theory or another. It's contradictory and absolutely unacceptable under any circumstances. The same is true, as we pointed out earlier, of evolution. You don't have to accept evolution practically or otherwise in order to be justified in reaping the benefits of so-called microevolution research in medicine. The ontology of evolution and the metaphysics of whatever mechanism is proposed to describe it are unacceptable no matter what. No matter what. You have to believe that's not what you're looking at when you observe some bacteria as it mutates rapidly in a petri dish. It's not evolution. So there is no such thing as a practical instrumentalist acceptance of evolution in the sense explained above or in any other sense. Now, to conclude this long response, I really urge Brother Hamza to take a break from lectures and debates and from reading philosophy and run to a scholar of Sunnah to restart his education in Aqidah, because right now he's got his wires so mixed up he cannot at any degree of consistency ascribe himself to one particular creed of Aqidah in Islam, and he's unknowingly embraced Christian theology in issues that he's obviously unaware of what they would entail in his faith and his religion. Learn about the Salaf's condemnation of Kalam, brother, and quit practicing it altogether, Craig's version or otherwise. That's what you should do. Don't let your pride and your devil fool you into mistaking the self-satisfaction that such lectures and debates give you for a sign that you're doing the right thing serving Islam, because you're not. learn Islam the way it is supposed to be learned, and then study the philosophy of science, and then afterwards study the philosophy of science once you're qualified, and only then could you aspire to really address the issues of naturalism, methodological and metaphysical, in a way that does not lead Muslims astray, unbeknownst to you. I pray to Allah to guide you and all Muslims to the path of the Salaf, the disciples of our Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi awwalan wa akhira. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
قناة إقناع فيما نرجو.
سحابة خير أمطرت على أرض جرداء،
تحمل من كل زوجين اثنين،
المؤمن والملحد،
الضال والمهتدي،
الموقن والشاك،
فأنبتت بما تحمله من ماء الحياة حيث نصوص الوحيين
ثمار اليقين في قلوب المؤمنين،
وصقلت بذات الماء قلوب المعاندين.